Good morning, Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1457. Aleph Tov Nun Zayin. Discussing neshamas, souls. Bnos Yerusholayim is the beginning of this section. In the pasuk Shcheira Ani V'Nova, I am dark and beautiful, or but beautiful. Bnos Yerusholayim. Knesset Yisrael, the souls as they are down below, in a body and animal, so say to the souls above, to the daughters of Yerusholayim, that's in a they're in a state of Yerusholayim, complete reverence, complete bittul. What do they say? I'm dark but beautiful. And we'll get back to that soon. So the Rebbe Rashab, in explaining this, is elaborating on what is this Bnei Yerusholayim. What are these souls above? So namely, they're neshamas of Atzilus, and then a neshamas of Atzilus, Malchus of Atzilus, especially in a state of ibur, of pregnancy, which is the word used here, meaning the souls are part of Atzilus itself, and Atzilus within it radiates the mohus of Elikus, the personality of the divine, and even the etzem ha'er, like we learned yesterday. So all the qualities of Atzilus, including that is the vision, the unity, where you don't see as much, the focus is not that much on the details and the breakdown of each individual part, but on the cohesive whole, the isachdus, the skalus and isachdus, the interconnectivity and unification of everything, in contrast to Biyah, where the focus is more on each detail. And furthermore, it's a level of Etzema Era Ela Al Kulona, from the 10 hidden spheres, where everything is mamish one there, that also radiates in Atzilus. So the neshamas in Atzilus, when they're in a state of ibur especially, they're connected to that consciousness. That's the utter bittul of Yerusholayim. Then when the neshamas come down to Biyah, there he says, Mashenk Shiard LeBiyah, that even Atzilus within Biyah, Eina Er Kamei B'Atzilus. The consciousness and the energy awareness of the divine is not quite as it is in Atzilus. As we learned at length, and the parsa is what divides, that creates the paradigm shift between the two states of consciousness, Atzilus consciousness and Biyah consciousness. Let's call it that. Okay. Then came the next part, with the breakdown of the actual different types of souls. So all souls originate in Atzilus. He made that very clear. He said that, we learned that, he said these words. He says, Kol HaNeshama, he says like this. The Sheidish Kulam Hu Ba'Atzilus. The root of all souls in Atzilus. However, there's a difference of what personality they assume, which means they all originate in Atzilus, but some retain the Atzilus consciousness that we just described. Some come into the level of the Atzilus Shebebiyah consciousness, which is already lower because it's Atzilus as it shines inside Biyah. And the third level, he said, is Biyah consciousness. And then he went on to say that every one of us, since we're all rooted in Atzilus, have all these three, but then he adds a fourth one. The fourth is the Beriyah Sheba Atzilus. And what is the four? The four is, yes, Neshama is the Atzilus Sheba Biyah, and Neshama is the Biyah Mamish. And here's how it works. There's how they stand in a state of Ibur, in Atzilus, in Malchus, and that's what we experience on Shmini Atzeres, when the seed, when the seed is absorbed, and it becomes an active, a viable conception. That's in Shmini Atzeres. That's the way it's the state of Ibur in Malchus of Atzilus, and that corresponds to the level of Tahirihi. We say Neshama and Nesat to be Tahirihi. The next is the level Kameshem Bechinis Leida B'Atzilus. They're no longer in a state of Ibur, but it's now become a separate entity in Atzilus itself, and he calls that Shaboim B'Atzilus Shebebiyah, I'm sorry, my mistake. The Shem Bechinas Leida B'Atzilus is a separate entity in Atzilus. That's called Biyah in Atzilus. That's two. That's Ata Barasa. Then comes the third level. How Atzilus comes into Biyah, that's Yitzarta. And the fourth level is how it's Biyah itself. That's Nefachta, as he explained in the parentheses. So Tehera is Bechinas Ayin Mamish, Primis Akem Atzilus, Ibur. And then Barasa is Beriyah Shabatzilus. So it's now an entity, a separate entity, but it's still an Atzilus. And they're like Ke'en HaKelim, Beriyah Shabatzilus. Yitzira is Galus of Atzilus Shebebiyah, and Nefachta is Biyah itself. So in general, I mentioned yesterday, these four are generally Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya. But here he's explaining them all in the context of two levels within Atzilus, and then one how Atzilus comes into Biyah, and how Biyah is within Biyah. These are the four levels within each neshama. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that generally the soul is separated in several levels. The Atzilus level, there's the Atzilus Shebebriya level, Shebebiyah level, and Biyah. That's what we learned. Now we still have to go back to remember, he said, who are the neshamas of Atzilus? He mentioned Moshe and the Ovis. But he didn't distinguish between them. We're going to learn now there is a distinction between them as well in this context. So he doesn't really elaborate which souls come from which level. Besides saying Moshe and the Ovis, doesn't tell us, for example, who are souls of neshamas, who are the souls that are on level 2, which is Atzilus and Biyah, and who are level souls that are just Biyah. What we could derive from this is that all of us fit into one of these categories. Most likely, it's the tzaddikim and the rabbeim and Ovis and the Moshe that are the highest level. But other neshamas, mostly we are referred to as usually neshamas of Biyah. But there too, it could be a neshama of Beriyah, it could be a neshama of Yitzira, a neshama of Asiya. So just for the record, he does not go into all the details. He's speaking in general, broader strokes. But you could definitely, if you're looking to research it further, you can definitely go deeper into it and find out like which soul comes from where. But right here, he just suffices with that because that's not the theme here. He's not coming here to explain individual souls. He's coming to explain the conversation between the neshamas below that are dark and the neshamas above that are Bnei Yerusholayim, which we'll get back to shortly. So he's not really going into it, but while he's discussing, he's already giving us somewhat of the map of the levels of souls, at least I said in general terms. But it could be elaborated upon, and maybe I'll do that a little later once we cover the actual text and the pshat that the Rebbe Rashab is saying. Maybe we'll go a bit deeper into some of these levels. But right now, we understand the difference in Atzilus. Just to sum up, the difference in Atzilus and Biyah, that's clear. He made that distinction. And then he spoke about several levels of souls as they are, and there's different levels of consciousness. So whatever we've learned about Atzilus, we can understand that the Ovis, Moshe and the Ovis, have that total bittul of Yerusholayim, basically. But we're going to learn more about that now as we continue reading on. Are there any questions about what I've just summed up? Okay. So let's continue reading. The line is approximately halfway down the page, 1457. The line begins Shebebiyah. After he explains Tahira, Barasa, Yetzarta, Nefachta, and he actually uses the verse. In the prayer, we say the words Zen Shamash and Asat bi Tahiri, Ata Barasa, Ata Yetzarta, Ata Nefachta bi. In the Posuk in Yeshaya, which is brought also at the end of Pirkei Avos, it says Ulukvedi, Kol Hanikar Shmi, Ulukvedi, Barasav Yetzartiv Afasisiv. See, he also refers to that when he says Barasiv Yetzartiv, but it corresponds basically the four levels of Atzilus, Beriyah, Yitzir, Asiya. But he also explained it, like we just learned, more specifically in the four levels of each that every soul has. Okay. He also doesn't mention, besides Shmini Atzeres and the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, doesn't mention what about the other times of the year. So I did mention yesterday that the three prayers that we say every day is usually connected Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, which is Barasa, Yitzir, and Asiya. and Shabbos you add the Tahira of Chaya, and a Yom Kippur there's Yechida of the fifth level, which he doesn't refer to a fifth level here. Here he's talking about 4 levels. Okay, so let's continue reading now. So he says like this: the neshamas hagavoyos, going back to the high level souls. Gavoya means high. Neshamas hagavoyos, the high level souls that are in a high state. Hu sheyardu lebiyah k'may shehein b'atzilus mamish. Now that we've explained that there are different levels of souls, and you said that all of them are rooted in Atzilus. So what's the difference between one and the next? Why are some neshamas greater than others as they come down below? So he says because the great neshamas, the way they descend in Biyah, the neshamas go, they go into Biyah retaining their Atzilus personality. They don't lose that personality. They are exactly that. Like he said that earlier also. When he spoke about but he said about Moshe and the Ovis, the expression was, he brought the Likkutei Torah from the beard of Seis Tossis, rather. So that's what makes these neshamas. That's why they're such great souls. Because even when they're in the Biyah, they're still Atzilus neshamas. They're just going into Biyah. And they'll ultimately come down to this earth as well. But they are, as they come down below, they remain what they were above. A second scenario is that they are b'pchinas Atzilus shebebiyah. In some cases, the neshamas gavayos are either Atzilus mamish, or when they come into Biyah, they still retain the Atzilus within Biyah, which we learned is already a lower state than Atzilus mamish. It's the second stage. It's Atzilus shebebiyah. Second in the context of the 3, not the 4. So it's Atzilus shebebiyah. So both scenarios are possible. That a high neshama is either mamish Atzilus, and the other is Atzilus shebebiyah, and he's going to explain the parentheses. That's the difference between Moshe and Avram. But in either case, they're not neshamas of biyah mamish. No, the neshama of biyah would be a neshama that's its Atzilus personality recedes in the background, and what does it assume? It becomes a neshama biyah. Here we're talking about a neshama gavei that's either pure Atzilus in biyah, or it's Atzilus shebe biyah. So it's Atzilus in one state lower as Atzilus enters into biyah, like we said, from the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus becomes Naran, Nefesh Ruach Neshama of biyah, as we learned, which is one step below. So that's what he says here about these neshamas hagavayos. And now comes a parenthesis. The rest of the paragraph is a parenthesis explaining this with Efshe Yesh Leimer. But even though I just read one line, just want to stop again if anybody wants to ask anything. If not, we're going to go into the parentheses. Okay. So now he says like this: the Efshe Yesh Leimer b'derech Efsher. So interesting, he says Efsher twice. Maybe we can say as a possibility. That's what the Rebbe Rashab is saying. Beis Dal Aleph is b'derech Efsher usually. So Efsher Yesh Leimer b'derech Efsher. I don't think I've ever seen twice that word Efsher used. Usually you say Efsher Yesh Leimer, or you say Yesh Leimer b'derech Efsher. Here he's saying Efsher Yesh Leimer b'derech Efsher. Unless it's another acronym, but I've not seen another acronym that would work here. So just pointing that out. So here's the Efshe Yesh Leimer. Here's what we possibly can say. The Masha Moshe leipsik taime begavayhu, Avram psik taime. Okay, let me explain before we continue reading. You may recall we learned this already earlier. I'll tell you what page, by the who. When we learned about who, I'm going back now to page right here. Remember the 5 times who. So he spoke the difference between Moshe and, here we are. Page 14, I believe 14, yeah. Page 14. So this is a Zohar that talks about, we find in the Torah that by Moshe we say twice Moshe, and by Avram we find twice Avram. By the Akedah, actually. And by Moshe, it's also twice Moshe. So the Zohar emphasizes that by Moshe, there's no psik timer between them. You say Moshe, Moshe without a line that separates. So in a Chumash, you could see a psik timer is like it's not a dash, it's not a hyphen, it's a line, a straight line that separates two words, psik timer. And in Trup, when you read the Torah, it's necessary because it means there's some pause between the two. Psik time is like a tam of a psik, like a separation, like a comma, so to speak. By Avram, there is a psik time. So the Zohar explains, and Chassidus elaborates, the difference is that Avram below is not exactly like Avram above. There is some shift. That's the psik time. That's the line in between. By Moshe, it's exactly the same Moshe as he was above. That's how he was below. So it's still, Avram is also below like above, but there with some shift. So he's now going to explain the difference between Moshe and Avram in the context of what we're describing now. So back on 14:14, he actually made that distinction as well. He said, though Avram, who Avram, that was the pasuk there, Avram, who Avram, but still Moshe, he said, was even higher than that. And Moshe was able to draw down below exactly as it was above, literally seamless. And Avram, there is some filter, some small filter at least, some measure. So he says like this: we have Shleimus of Yirah, the Moshe leipsik timer. That when you say Moshe does not have this separate line, this pause, the gavayu between them, that separates them. Avram psik timer, and Avram there is a psik timer. He says maybe we can say, in the context of what we're learning here, like this: who? What can we say? The nishmas Moshe hayelamata kaMoshe Atzilus mamish. The soul of Moshe was below when he came down to below, all the way down below to earth. It's mamish as he was Atzilus mamish. Whereas nishmas Avram lamata, so that's Atzilus mamish, the first level. The nishma of Avram lamata haye bechinas Atzilus shebebiyah. It's one measure lower than that. Atzilus has already entered into Biyah. We're not talking about Atzilus mamish as it is in Atzilus. It's come into Biyah. Like he said when he spoke about Bechinas Leida B'Atzilus, and then it comes Shaboim B'Atzilus Shabiyah. Atzilus is now coming into Biyah. So that was the second level, not the first level. And that's the difference between Moshe and Avram. That's how he initially explains it. But now the Rebbe Rashab is going to qualify that and say that according to a Zohar, it's not quite that way. It's even higher than that. Avram is higher than that. And that's the next piece that we're going to learn. But that's what he just established. So we have now an example of Moshe and Avram, that's Atzilus Mamish, and this is Atzilus Shebebiyah. Now, mind you, there's no explanation in Chabad, in Havana, in understanding what is the difference between the two. However, back on page 14:14, there is an explanation. There he says that Moshe's Amshach Lamata was a permanent effect on earth, and Avram's Amshach was a temporary effect. So you see from that a distinction, that, and the fact is Moshe brought Torah down below. Remember, Avram, as much as he kept the Torah himself, as much as he taught, so all his qualities, he was not the Makabla Torah, Moshe Kibbutz Torah Messinai. So you clearly see that Moshe had elements that Avram did not have in bringing down the Torah down below. And there's other differences. Moshe is a Novi. The level of prophecy of Moshe was unparalleled. Nobody, Lo Yahya Novi, Moshe, the pasuk says. No, there was no prophet on the level of Moshe who spoke to God face to face. And other distinctions. He doesn't go into detail here because, again, this is not the theme. He's just giving us certain basic points that you can then unpack and discuss in detail and understand many ideas. But this is somewhat concentrated, but it's enough to be able to work with. So I'm emphasizing that there's a lot to be able to develop here, but he's not developing it. But I'm definitely acknowledging there is much more to say. So let's continue. Now he adds this. So So the Idr Rabbah adds something about the psik timer. The Idr Rabbah on page 138a, Idr Rabbah is Zoyar Pasha Noseh. So I believe, if I recall correctly, I think he brought it earlier as well. Let me just see. He may have brought this Idr Rabbah on the top there. Let me see. Yeah, because initially on top there, he brought that Moshe and Avram were similar level. Then later he distinguished between them. Did he bring the Zohar? But Idr Rabbah? Okay, I don't see it. So maybe he didn't. 1 minute. Okay, fine. Anyway, according to the Idr Rabbah, what does the Idr Rabbah say? Avram, psik time basra shlim. That when it says Avram, though it has a line between, but basra shlim, the latter Avram, the second one, even though it comes after a line that separates, but it's complete. So it's more than just Avram, like a separation. He says clearly it's complete. So according to the Idr Rabbah, you see Avram is more than just what we initially assumed, that there's a separation. So how do you explain that? So he says, Tzorech Leimer, according to this Idr Rabbah, that there's Avram, the second Avram is complete. He says, Tzorech Leimer de biyiridose lemata, that when Avram came down below, Nase b'bchinas merkava lechesed Atzilus. When he came down below, he became a chariot, a channel for Chesed Atzilus. Atzilus, not just Atzilus in Beriyah, Atzilus. Dahainu, which means Shenesala Nishmosa like Moshe Atzilus Mamish. So it's true that Avram first came down from Atzilus into Atzilus Shebebiyah, but when he came down below, his neshama elevated, and he became Mamish like Atzilus. What he said before, like Moshe. That's one way to explain the Idr Rabbah. That's what the Idr Rabbah is emphasizing. That even though Avram does have a psik timer, but Avram Basra, the second Avram, as he comes down below, is complete. Why? Because he's now is below. He's like Chesed of Atzilus Mamash. That's one way to explain it. Another, Oi, Gam Lies Bechinis Iskalus Mamash Besses Sfiras Atzilus. Because the first thing you say that he's a makava for Chesed of Atzilus. How do we know about the other levels of Atzilus? Remember, earlier we learned that Atzilus is a united entity of all 10 spheres and the synergy that comes with that. So he's saying now, Oy, even more. Oy lies, b'bchinas iskaulus mamish be'estes spheres Atzilus. Or we can say even more than that. That Avram was iskaulus mamish, completely encompassed, completely interconnected with the 10 spheres of Atzilus, not just Chesed of Atzilus. So essentially, two ways of explaining, or one deeper, one greater than the other, of explaining Avram's role when he came down below. He was like mamish like Atzilus, either Chesed of Atzilus or all the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Like he writes in the Sefer HaBoyer. Sefer HaBoyer is one of the early Kabbalistic works, close to the time of the Zohar. Different discussion who authored it, but it means also Zohar means to radiate light. Zohar is the word from the word light, and Boyer also means to illuminate. So it's the Sefer HaBoyer. He writes like this: Shari Avram Eimed u'Meshamish bimkemi. There he brings a Chesed of Atzilus, says to Hashem, "What do you need me for? Once you have Avram on earth, Avram comes and stands and serves in my place. Bimkemi, shehichlif mokim midas hachesed. He replaced the function, the role of the attribute of chesed. Before Avram was there, so chesed of Atzilus was the source of chesed in existence. But once Avram was there, the chesed of Atzilus tells Hashem, you don't need me. Avram is now down below. He's serving, and he embodies and personifies me, chesed, mimkemi, in my place. Shehichlif mokem midas chesed. So we see from that, Chesed Atzilus would not say that if Avram in some way diluted Chesed. If Avram was only Atzilus within Biyah, not Atzilus Mamish, then Chesed could say, okay, Avram is doing Chesed in this world, but there's a higher level of Chesed in Atzilus. The fact that Chesed of Atzilus is saying that Avram is replacing me means he's replacing all of me. Because Avram was encompassed down below in the Pnimius HaKeli, like when we spoke about Ibur before, like he's encompassed within the inner container of Chesed, of the level of Chesed of Atzilus Mamish, and therefore that's why the Chesed of Atzilus is saying he's replaced me, he's taken my place, he's fulfilling my role. So what do you see from that? That Avram is representing Mamish Chesed of Atzilus Mamish. Now, based on this, you still have to say Moshe is a higher level, because Moshe doesn't have even a psik timer altogether. Doesn't need any qualification. But he doesn't go into what would make Moshe higher than this. That's another that we need to discuss and try to figure that out on our own. Rebbe Rashab doesn't explain it. In the first explanation, before the Idir Rabbah, he's talking Moshe is Atzilus Mamish and Avram is Atzilus and Biyah. But now, based on the Idir Rabbah, Avram is also Atzilus Mamish. So there's many ways you can explain it, that he's only mainly Chesed, is through the channel of Chesed. Moshe maybe draws all the spheres. There's ways we can explain that. Even though he says Avram also it's all the spheres, but it's still perhaps through the prism, through the channel of Chesed, but he doesn't explain. Umavur, one more line, and then we'll conclude this paragraph. Umavur b'Zohar Sham, and the Zohar he explains there, and I'm assuming the Zohar is Idir Rabbah. Mama shows the Idir Rabbah. So what does he say? That this came through the Nisyonos. So Avram indeed on his own is Atzilus Shebibiyah. But once he came down below, something happened to Avram that elevated him. The Nisyonos. We know Asara Nisyonos, Avram was challenged, and he passed 3 difficult tests. Nisyonos, with the last test being the Nisayon of the Akedah, of the binding and offering of Yitzchak. So that's what the Nisyonos did. They elevated. That's why he said before that Shenes'ala Nishmaseh. So it's not a contradiction to what he said before. The psik time it shows that Avram is not like Moshe, and he's a lower Atzilus and Biyah. Moshe is Atzilus Mamish. But then when he came down below, and he went through the Nisyonos, the challenges, so his neshama was elevated, that now he was drawing straight from Atzilus on earth, Atzilus Mamish, Chesed of Atzilus Mamish, and the spheres of Atzilus. And that's why, going back, you remember who called Yerusholayim Yirah? V'zeu Shavram Kara Yirah. That's the idea. But he said earlier, when did Avram call Yerusholayim Yirah? By the Nisayon of the Akedah. At the end of the 10th test, the Nisayon Akedah, he looked up and realized this is the Har HaBayis. This is the Temple Mount where Hashem will appear, and Hashem has appeared. So that's why he called it Yirah, because Yirah, because God appears there, like we learned earlier, the vision that brings the Yirah Shalom that Avram Avinu experienced. So that's what he's saying. So Avram, that's when now it all comes together. So Avram, through the Nisayon, experienced Yirah of Yerusholayim, the Yirah part. In the Nisayon of the Akedah, the Nisayon was brought him to that level, which essentially is saying through the Nisyonos, Avram came to a similar level like Moshe, though he doesn't explicitly state that. But as I pointed out, still Moshe, you have to say, is even a higher level. But that's, as I said, a discussion outside of the scope of what the Rebbe Rashab does address here. But there is something to talk about, and I don't want to go into speculating on that. I'd rather focus on understanding Pshat right here and continuing the discussion with Bnei Yerushalayim. So this brings together this last piece, and it's a very fascinating parenthesis. The Rebbe Rashab, this is his addition. He says clearly, Yeshleim b'derech efsher, efshi Yeshleim b'derech efsher, and that is what he just added now. So let me pause here and stop if there are any questions.
I have a question about if the second explanation of which is the Idra Rabbah, saying that as a result of the 10 Nisyanos, which the last of which was the Akeda, so therefore his neshama was transformed from being Atzilus Shebabiyah into Mamash
I would say
Atzilus.
elevated. I would use the word elevated.
Okay, rather than transformed. Thank you. Okay, but that's the very moment where the angel calls out Avram with the psik taima. So it's a little. I mean, I'm not chas v'shalom, I'm criticizing the analysis here, but it's a little unusual. At the very point of the psik taima is to say that he was a neshama of Atzilus in Biyah, and then now he's saying it's that mamash, that moment when the angel's called out like that.
Read the Idra Rabbah. Comes the Idra Rabbah and says that when you say psik taima basra shlim, that's exactly what happened. There was that Avram's second Avram, even what he was below, and initially Atzilus Shebabiyah, has now elevated to the level of Atzilus Mamash. That's what the Idra Rabbah qualifies.
So I posted a psik taima in the chat thread. I don't understand what he means by Abraham became completed. I mean, there's no more psik taima, because the way that the word is spelled identical. Well, I guess there's one trope note that's different.
But the Idra Rabbah adds something. It says that even though there's a psik taima basra shlim, the bottom one, the second Avram, is complete now. So it basically means Avram came down Atzilus Shebabiyah, and through the nisayon of that Akeda, he elevated. And that's what the pasuk is coming to emphasize. Both aspects. That Avram, even as he came down below, didn't remain Atzilus Shebabiyah. He's now basra shlim. The last Avram is complete in the sense that he's elevated to the level of Chesed of Atzilus Mamash.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One other small question: why does right before the parentheses, you actually stopped to ask a question I meant to ask? Where it says the neshamos hagvos hu sheyardu. Why doesn't it say hen, hey nun sofit?
So this is common. Doesn't always. The Rebbe has a letter that the digduk is not always exactly precise according to the laws of digduk in Hebrew.
So you would make
either
nothing
is because
of that.
he's speaking about them as a group, as an individual group. I can't really answer that.
Okay.
So it's either he means who as I said, as a group, the whole category of neshamas hagavayis, as opposed to the specific different ones. Yeah. He does say Moshe Hein Batzilus Mamish right afterwards.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I blew right through that one. The who bothered me, but the Moshe Hein is this is exactly my question.
Okay, yeah. But this is not uncommon. It's not. I don't know if you could learn much into it, unless, as I said, he's talking about a category. Then he's talking about how they come down specific. Maybe because, like he spoke before, that Atzilus is Achdus, so maybe they're all like one there. I'm not sure. I don't know if you could. Again, I don't know if I'd read into it too much.
Okay, well, those are nice speculations, anyways. Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? What's interesting also that struck me is earlier we learned that Avram called it Yirah, and it was Shem that called it Shalom. Now Shem came before Avram. However, it's interesting because based on what he's saying here, it sounds like Avram reached the level of Yirah Shalom, and Hashem gave it the name. He joined both names, Yirah and Shalom. But is it possible to say that Avram added Yirah to the Shalom that Shem already had said? So therefore Avram has both Yirah Shalom, or do you say that Avram had Yirah, but he didn't have Shalom until after the Nisayon? Anyway, I don't know if that's pshat. I don't think that would be accurate. because he's saying here that it's due to the Nisayan that he called it Yirah. It was after the Nisayan of the Akedah. Okay, just a footnote.
Does it say anywhere? Does it say anywhere? Does it say anywhere in Chassidus or even Nigla that Yerusholayim is named after Abraham? And I mean separate from the Yirah, like Mamish Yerushalayim.
He brought the Medrash. This was clearly in Medrash. On page 1455, he brought the Medrash, he said, and Tosfos. Do you remember that? Medrash Rabbah Vayera, chapter 56, and the Tosfos in Tainus, page 16a. Look on page 14. This is all taken from Nigla.
What part of 255?
Where the subject begins in the second paragraph.
No, I'm just saying, I was just on the page. Yeah, all right.
Second paragraph.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? So let's continue reading. So now that we've established this idea of Atzilus and Beriyah, and also some of the details around it and which Sham is on which level, he's going to go back now to the point of departure, the level of Bnos Yerusholayim. And now he's going to take it back to the verse of the conversation or the declaration, the statement that neshamas below say to the neshamas above in Atzilus. So he says now like this, new paragraph. V'hinei, and now hanashamas kashem b'bchinas ibur b'bchinas malchus. We just established that the neshamas, all neshamas, especially neshamas gevayis, because they retain that level, but all souls, when they're in the state of ibur, in the level of malchus of Atzilus, they're in a state of pregnancy, which means they're one with, like the fetus is one with the mother. So these neshamas are one with Atzilus, as we learned earlier. Nikrois Bnei Yerushalayim. These souls are called the daughters of Yerushalayim. Shebehemu Shleimus of Yirah. Because these souls on that level have Shleimus of Yirah, the complete bittul, complete absorption, and the complete nullification, as they're encompassed within the mother in the example, and Atzilus in the moral. Mipnei, due to the fact, Shemeir behem, Pchinas HaKav, remember the Kav, because it radiates within them in Atzilus, Me'erein Sof HaMeir be'eses Sfiras Atzilus. Because in them they have direct line to the artery, to the main artery, to the main line of the Kav, which comes from Me'erein Sof, which radiates in the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Being that these neshamas are absorbed, like the Uber, in state of Ibur, in Malchus of Atzilus, so they're directly drawing from that Kav. That's called, and that's why they have this Yerusholayim, the complete reverence, the complete bittul that we learned earlier. Al-Kain, and because they're drawing from there, Al-Kain, therefore, Hein b'bchinas Shleimus of Yirah. Not just Yirah, Yirah law. They're complete Yirah, complete reverence. B'bchinas bittul and mitzias. Not just bittul yesh. Their whole being is absorbed and experiences the consciousness of Elokus. So the neshamas are experiencing that, similar to our fetus is experiencing its mother, the 9 months in its womb, in the mother's womb. Ukamoi came, and so too is it. The neshamas that Atzilus b'chlal, with the souls of Atzilus in general, gam b'bchinas Atzilus shebebriyah. This includes also the neshamas of Atzilus within Beriyah, because it's still Atzilus within Beriyah. It's true, it's a step down, but nevertheless, it's Atzilus shebebriyah. Why? Liyas da Atzilus b'chinas gili amahuz delikus. Being that in Atzilus, being that Atzilus is the gili, the revelation of the very personality of the divine, not just that it exists, but they experience their consciousness experiences what Elokus is like. Mahus Elokus. So now I see there's a parenthesis that goes for quite a few lines. So I'm skipping the parentheses just to finish the sentence. Valkain, Heim B'chinas B'nei Yerusholayim. I'm reading 4 lines from the bottom. I skipped the parentheses. That's why being in a state of the daughters of Yerusholayim, I'm sorry, Valkain, and that's why, because they're in Atzilus, that's why Heim B'chinas B'nei Yerusholayim. That's why they're in a state of the daughters of Yerusholayim. B'chinas Shleimus of Yirah. So he's saying 2 things here. All neshamas, when they're in a state of ibur, are that state of Shleimus of Yirah. And the same thing is when you're talking about the neshamas of Atzilus, like Moshe, the Oves, Avram, are also that way because Atzilus creates this state of Shleimus of Yirah. That's why they're called Bnei Yerushalayim. So now we have to go back to the parentheses. I just skipped it because I wanted to just read the full sentence. So that's the neshamas lamaila. Should we do the parentheses now, or should I stop here? Let me see. I'd probably stop here because this could be a little dense, and I don't want to overwhelm myself and us and all of us. So I'm going to do the parentheses tomorrow. That's what I'm going to do. Yeah, because he goes now into what Atzilus Beriyah is, and Gan Eden, a new piece here that he hasn't brought up yet till now. So I think simply in the terms of we need somewhat of a parsa here, or psik taima, whatever you want to call it. We need some form of. So I think I'm going to stop, and this next piece, the parentheses, we'll learn tomorrow. So we have plenty to absorb here. Yeah, so I'm going to stop here. But any questions?
I was just going to ask you a question.
Just for the record, 1 second. Just for the record, after this, if you look at the last line, then he's going to now go back to neshamas as they come down below, because this is still neshamas and Atzilus, or in their root in the state of ibur, and then they come down below, and that's when he's going to go back to shreirani on the top of the next page. Just giving you the flow of and context. Okay, but I will stop here. Yeah.
So my question, I was actually about the parts that was funny. You said that last moment. This Inyan of a neshama that is Atzilus that goes into Biyah, but still maintains its Atzilus-like status. The idea of direct Abraham that radiates in the 10 spheres of Atzilus. So nevertheless, a neshama that's an ibur, that's a neshama that's in the Atzilus, but a neshama that's Atzilus that goes into Biyah, doesn't that necessarily have to go through the parsa? And isn't that how could it radiate, unmitigated elikus of Atzilus if it's gone through the parsa, which is a dimensional downshift, if you will, or decline on an opposite of elevation, Yerida. It's a dimensional Yerida. How can it be that it's transmitting or radiating the elikus of Atzilus? It seems like a paradox or contradiction.
You're talking about Avram now, or you're talking in general?
Either. I mean, well, no. Avram, it says that he was elevated from a neshama of Atzilus Shababiyah into a neshama that's purely Atzilus. Total. So that's not what I'm talking about. We talked about there are, I think, 4 levels. One is a neshama that's purely an Atzilus. The other is, let's see, Atzilus.
So if you go back to what I always point out, to find an example that works that we can relate to, not turn this into mechanics or technical. Think of it like Atzilus is the source of the idea that's coming from a teacher. Atzilus mamish he's conveying it without any filters at all. That's like Moshe. Then Atzilus comes into Biyah, there's a student, but it's a high level student, so he's able to receive Atzilus, but through a filter called the parsa. So it's still the original idea of Atzilus, but it is going through a filter, the parsa, and that's called Atzilus Shebebiyah. And then comes the next level, a student who can't hear the idea the way it is in its original form. So now he needs another example, or he needs another paradigm to be able to explain the idea, because he's a beginner student. So the teacher needs to dress it up even more in the garments of Biyah. So you could find many examples where you could find levels where it's simply gradations. So you have Atzilus Mamish, you have Atzilus within Biyah, and then you have Atzilus. Then you have Biyah, as Biyah becomes the primary identity of the entity. We learned, for example, Yeshua. When Yeshua was sitting before Moshe, he was like, in a way, he was not Moshe, but he was much closer to Moshe. He was Mekabel from him. And then when Yeshua became a separate leader on his own, he went down a level. So you could find many examples of Atzilus and Biyah, and then Biyah.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
In general, all these ideas, as I pointed out many times, are always easier understood when you find examples that work that you can relate to. Because to try to figure this out on its own, we have no visual evidence, and we can't empirically go ahead and open up and dissect Atzilus and the Parsa and Biyah to see what's going on there. So we need to find something that we can relate to and say, okay, let me see an example, and then find these levels in that example. Go ahead, Robin. Yeah.
Thanks, Rabbi. Sorry, I missed the beginning of the class, but could you clarify on the daughters of Yerusholayim? I mean, where do they reside? Are they, like, if everybody can relate to that, where are they residing, sort of, if you see what I'm saying?
Well, they're basically the level of the souls before they come down into bodies below.
But
So
are they?
We all have it in our root. It's like saying, where does the Etzem and Neshama reside? The core soul resides on its level. We access it when we say Tahorihi every day, but it's not the level of the soul that we're actively involved in on a daily basis, except those few souls, the great souls like Moshe or Avram and others, that even when they are functioning on a daily level, on a routine level down on earth, they still are such level souls. Basically, it's the level of utter connection, utter devotion. When you say a soul, even when a soul sins, even when a person sins or transgresses, you still say their core soul is connected. It's just they're not aware of it, and it's not revealed. It's not manifest. Mm-hmm. So basically, Bnos Yerushalayim is essentially talking about the soul as it is in its purest form. Just like we would talk about the inner child, just as like we have within us a state where we're totally connected to godliness, is an inner state of the soul, but it's not necessarily expressed in our conscious lives.
I understand, but it sits in Atzilus, and that's where it is.
Does that help you when you say that Atzilus? Atzilus generally is right here on earth, except it's the purest form of existence on a divine level. That is the level of Atzilus. Yeah.
It helps me. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Rabbi Jacobson, I find it very fascinating that piece that said that Abraham, the pause, was after his test. That's where he was able to elevate to the chesed of Atzilus. In our lives, I mean, we always have challenges. Everyone has challenges, and I always say you have to accept them with love. And I say at the end of the day, when Mashiach comes, we're going to thank Hashem for all the problems and all the tests and all the nisyonot that we had. This kind of brings it all together, because basically the test is a vehicle that Hashem provides for us to be able to elevate within each level that we're holding to a higher level. I think that's fascinating.
That's correct. Remember, through Avodah, our work below, everything he's talking about here is without the Avodah. Once you have Avodah like the Nisyonos, then a soul, even on a lower level, can elevate to a higher level. That's the whole point of this whole discussion in general, that the souls, as they come down below, through their work, can go up to the highest levels and even higher than Atzilus, as we shall learn, to the Etzem. Remember that. At the end, he's going to say, Shcheda and Ivanova, that the souls, even the ones that are darkened by this lowest of worlds, ultimately reach places that are even higher than the Shleimus of Atzilus. But that's through Avodah. That doesn't come automatically. That's through work. That's the work that we do. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, everybody. we'll stop here. So I'm pretty much close to the bottom of the page, 1457. However, there's a parenthesis that we have to go back to, which we will. But that's where we're up to and moving along, understanding the dynamics of souls.